Warning. The following may contain concepts, ideas, and/or reflections unique in nature and not yet approved by government and/or corporate entities. This content is for entertainment purposes only and is not intended to stimulate further reflection or to perpetuate additional discourse beyond the scope already outlined by institutional curriculum.
The topic of colonialism is a hard one to tackle, as it is difficult to look back on our history and definitively say, here, this is where it all started. Even trying to separate colonialism from simple conquest is a challenge. My best guess is that at some point the intelligentsia decided that calling their military exploits conquest was unsavory, so they constructed the hip new term colonialism. It was a logical choice, since the Latin colonia refers to farmland, which was what a large amount of the colonized area was used for. But it was also a little bit vague, because the colonies were also used for mining, production, slave trading, and military installations. But the PR is much better to be portrayed as a group of simple farmers who just happen to have a massive naval force. 300 years later, when people began to realize that colonialism meant more than trying to establish the largest farming co-op the world has ever seen, it was time for another change. Now they simply refer to it as globalism or global trade. But the reality is, it is nothing more than good old conquest. If we look for clear examples of colonialism, the countries of France, England, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands come to mind. In the span of 400 years, Spain, France, Portugal, and England had laid claim to nearly every square inch of the Americas, and in less time held roughly 80% of the total African landmass. In fact, at the end of World War I, an insane amount of the world was controlled by these five nations. In 1920, the British Empire controlled 26% of the planet, and France held 8.5%. In 1810, the Spanish Empire's domain extended to 10%, and Portugal held around 4% of the world. In 1938, the Dutch Empire only had 1.5% of the earth, but it was made up of some highly valuable and strategic locations. The question is, were these nations competing or cooperating? In the 17th and 18th centuries, these European titans did appear to be competing for global supremacy. However, something changed radically in the 19th and 20th centuries. The two main frontrunners of colonialism were France and England. I won't bore you with the complete history of these two nations, but here's a quick overview of how many wars these two superpowers have fought since the time of William the Conqueror. I counted 29 wars up to the Napoleonic Wars, and this is including the consolidation of the 100 Years' War, spanning from 1337 to 1453. With a history of conflict and the prize of world domination on the table, I find it strange that after 1815, these two behemoths never engaged in another conflict, if one ignores the actions of Vichy France under Nazi control from 1940 to 1942. So while these two colonizing powers were historical enemies, and both were intent on carving up the world, after Napoleon's defeat, they actually appeared to be working together, and were staunch allies. For example, in the 1830s, Great Britain had a foothold on the Horn of Africa, and France had just acquired a small sliver of Algeria in the north. But by 1920, the two nations were dominating the continent, and none of their bordering African holdings ever resulted in an armed conflict. The same is true when France invaded Vietnam, right beside England's Burmese state. This gives strong evidence that there was a cooperation between France and England, and subsequently the United States. America may have fought England for its independence with the aid of France, but that didn't stop them from exporting slave-picked cotton to British textile manufacturers shortly after winning the war. If we viewed this trio as a single entity, then in 1920, France, England, and the US spanned 41% of the entire globe. If Spain still controlled their colonies beyond their independence and joined the party, those four nations would control 51% of the world. However, after World War II, there was an independence party, and shortly after the dust had settled, everyone began gaining sovereignty, and they didn't even have to fight for it. This was a gift, just handed back to the people, free of charge. In 1946, the global elite had a change of heart, and took a vow of celibacy gave away all of their earthly possessions, and journeyed to a Tibetan monastery to find their spiritual centers. Or they handed back the people their nations because the notion of the nation-state was passé and no longer held any power. There was never any departure from colonialism. It is still with us, possibly even in a stronger form than ever before. Except that now the global elite hide behind the veil of corporate ownership to obfuscate their monopoly on the planet. While their abbreviated institutions dole out the rules for the world to follow, the governments enforce, while the global banks and international corporations profit. The World Health Organization governs health policies for the planet. We saw this in full effect recently. UNESCO controls education and the history of the world. And in owning the history, they may claim anything as a World Heritage Site. Machu Picchu isn't Peruvian, it is a part of global history. And they will instruct the Peruvians on how to properly preserve their site. The savanna and its wildlife must be preserved. So no hunting or farming may be done in vast sections of Africa. I wonder why they're struggling to feed themselves. The minerals under the Earth's surface are not a nation's property, but they are everyone's to share. Namely, the silver is Rio Tinto's, the gold, Barrick's, the oil, Chevron's, and the copper, Mitsubishi's. If any nation opposes these or any other poor multinational corporation, then your nation is clearly run by fascists. But don't worry, because the coalition of the willing is prepared to liberate your country on a peacekeeping mission. Be rest assured that their heat-seeking missiles will bombard your tiny little nation into unprecedented prosperity. The World Bank, the US Federal Reserve, and the IMF control the money supply, and as long as the US dollar remains the de facto global trade currency, their economic policy will dictate every other nation's, without exception. Mankind has used copper, silver, and gold as a legal tender for thousands of years. But today, out of roughly 195 independent nations, how many have a metals-backed currency? What? No one out there wants economic stability? Unfortunately, the nation with $31 trillion of debt and counting also has one of the most advanced militaries the world has ever seen. So who's going to question their money printing policies? Perhaps some people think that globalism is much better to people than colonialism has been. Globalism is kinder, more considerate of other people's feelings, and much more inclusive. Colonialism was Eurocentric, but globalism is about equality and diversity. But of course, this diversity is one of language and ethnicity, not a diversity of thought. However, colonialism has always been pro-mass immigration, which is why there are East Indians in Africa, Africans in America, and Europeans in Australia, America, and Africa. Why was there no immigration back to Europe? Because at that time, Europe was considered to be overpopulated already, and shipping in brown people there didn't make much sense. European working standards were quite low, and they didn't need any more cheap labor. This was not the case for the new colonies. Both colonialism and globalism treat people as a commodity. They just package it differently. However, this is nothing new, and this globalist playbook has been written before, many times over. After the dust is settled from war, large empires almost always hand back some liberties to the conquered. Because closing the iron fist is hard work, and eventually the empires want to kick back and enjoy their conquest. And to do so, they need to break out the velvet glove. In the time of Julius Caesar, Rome had subdued much of Western Europe, including nearly everything touching the Mediterranean. When everyone either traveled by ship, foot, or horse, having a military presence everywhere was nearly impossible. So how could they maintain control over their vassal states? They would allow for cultural diversity. The defeated could speak their own language, pray to their own gods, and if they were good little boys, they could even have their own puppet governments. And all that Rome asked in return was a commitment to provide soldiers in defense of the empire when required, and to do trade and pay taxes to Rome. Everything else was optional. After a time, the people would get closer to Rome, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Learning Latin would make it easier to prosper in the empire, and trade with Rome was much more profitable than domestic trade. The money of Rome was so enticing that even the Germanic tribes, who were never defeated militarily by Rome, were eventually lured into accepting Roman Catholicism, simply as a means to open up trade agreements with the empire. Centuries later, when England colonized North America, Africa, and Asia, it was with the express goal to civilize the savage. But why? To get the world's population into a decent pair of British woolen trousers? Or maybe it was to incorporate trade and commerce in areas where it previously didn't exist. In light of that, maybe nationalism was never what the British Empire was about. England's first foothold in Canada was in the form of the Hudson's Bay Company, which exported fine furs back to Europe. The northeast coast was for fisheries and whaling industries. South of that was for tobacco production, and further south was for cultivating cotton. The Caribbean islands produced sugarcane, rum, and chocolate to be exported internationally. South Africa had diamond mines, and the Savannah had expensive ivory. The East Indian Trading Company imported all sorts of Asian products unique to the continent back to England. The pattern here is global trade, which has always been at the forefront of colonialism. Forget the slogan, "For King and Country." Those are empty words fed to the populace to hide the truth, that all of the spilt blood is for the international bankers and their corporate partners. If you follow their rules and allow them to exploit your resources, then you may live as a free nation, but disobey and see how far you get. South Africa is now independent, and while the white Afrikaners may experience the change, it is hardly a blip on the radar for the De Beers Mining Company. Libya was liberated in 2011, and all of those nationally owned oil reserves were also liberated into the hands of Western oil companies. The US couldn't control terrorism in Afghanistan, but they could maintain the poppy production. The major wars of the modern era are consistent. The governments from both sides are saddled with massive debts, and the banks and international corporations are saddled with massive profits. Currently, it would be easy to consider that the Western powers are being challenged by Russia and China, but I would take that conclusion with a grain of salt. In 1985, nearly 63% of China's workforce was in agriculture, and it was the 9th largest economy, behind Canada. Today, they are heavily industrialized, and the 2nd largest economy in the world. Who did this? Did China just get a growth spurt out of nowhere? Or was it propped up by the West? We outsourced our jobs there, built mega factories on top of rice paddies. Western engineers designed their bridges. Western architects conceptualized their skylines. American weapons contractors sold them trade secrets. Western universities educated their new generation. We sold them properties in California, British Columbia, Toronto, London, and Paris. We sold them media giants and tech firms. But apparently now they are the enemy. Funny, because the new iPhone still says made in China. You gotta love modern warfare, where you can still have free trade with your sworn enemy. Russia may actually be at war with the West, but to say that this is a David and Goliath scenario would be an understatement. Russia has a fraction of the population, and a smaller fraction of the resources. But if they are indeed fighting for their survival, that may be their greatest advantage. I'm not Russian, and I have no stake in this conflict, except that I do understand the West. And to accuse Russia of expansionism is hypocritical. If this is a war, then it is safe to say that there is propaganda on all sides, and knowing the complete truth is nearly impossible. I'm not pro-war, and I do have sympathy for the Ukrainians stuck in the middle of a conflict between two superpowers, but I'm not a moron. Has NATO expanded? Sure. Is the West a nation of peace? Doubtful. Is there no military value in holding the Crimean Peninsula? In 1853, the Ottoman Empire, France, and England didn't seem to think so when they declared war on Russia over it. There were 750,000 casualties on all sides. Clearly not a small conflict. And now 150 years later, we are told that this is a one-sided act of aggression? Maybe it's all just a bunch of war theater to distract us from the truth. Because all the evidence points to the fact that we already have a one-world government. And the colonial powers who enslaved people across the globe, burned down the Amazon, filled the oceans with mercury, and waged wars with millions of casualties are still in charge. And their age-old policies of global slavery, industrial pollution, proxy wars, and planetary control are still in place. Western propaganda is spread worldwide to civilize the savage mind. Lands are seized in exchange for factory work. Freedoms are claimed in exchange for military service. Marriage is replaced with prostitution. Empty statesmen will substitute true leadership. And cultural diversity will be squeezed into a box which conforms to the global government's requirements. You may keep your skin color, but be sure to keep chasing that digital dollar, repeating the party lines, and repent of your savagery, or you have outlived your usefulness. This is the post-conquered world. Obey or be destroyed. The only consolation is that this was all inevitable. If Julius Caesar was born in the 20th century, Rome would be worldwide as well. The same could be said for Genghis Khan and his Mongolians, or Alexander the Great and his Macedonians. We could have easily been living under the Ottoman Empire, the Umayyad Caliphate, or the Qing dynasty. World conquest was going to happen at some point, but if history has any lessons, it is that every undefeatable behemoth will eventually crush itself under its own weight. We just have to step aside and